Hey, Patrick Coffin here. Normally I just do a rant or a commentary on Saturday, but I wanted to bring in my friend J.W. Richards, who's co-written a book that's really the book on the, first it was called Novel Coronavirus, then it was called COVID-19. I call it the CCP virus. We're having a virtual summit on the end of this month. That's Friday the 30th and Saturday, October 31st. By the way, those are the weekend of Halloween days, and the governors... The local governors in California, namely Los Angeles County and Ventura County, have banned trick-or-treating. So we're focusing on that on purpose, in a way. That's part of the decision to have the summit there. It's called Truth Over Fear, Unmasking COVID-19. Jay Richards has co-written with Douglas Axe and William Briggs, the famed celebrity to the stars. The Price of Panic, how the tyranny of experts turned a pandemic into a catastrophe. I did a little... commentary on this book the other day. So great to see you and meet you for the first time, Jay. Pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be with you. I'm really looking forward to the conference.
There's so many things to be said about how in just about every country that has a media mechanism, the same basic talking points that are used by news anchors, the same protocols that sort of come down from on high. It has the smell of a dress rehearsal for something else that the oligarchs who rule over us, it's like they're testing the waters. Like, what can we get these lemmings to do? We can give them required behavior that might not even have scientific basis. We can talk about modeling, and we can coin phrases like flatten the curve. And I mean, God bless them. It worked out pretty well, compliance-wise.
Yeah, it did. I mean, that's what's remarkable about it. I mean, we talk in the book about the actual origins for this population-wide lockdown actually started from a high school science experiment in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It ended up actually overturning the conventional wisdom, which was really the tried and true wisdom, which was that in a pandemic, you do quarantines. In other words, you isolate the sick, and you make special protection against the at-risk. This idea we're going to all lock down had never actually been tested. It was basically a theory based upon a computer model waiting for a triggering event. And that's what happened in 2020. We had a triggering event with this pandemic from the coronavirus, and then just sort of the mechanisms clicked into place. It really is, I think, the first truly planetary social contagion. And I think it's actually the social contagion that was triggered that's actually ultimately the more historic story. The coronavirus itself is comparable to other things like the Hong Kong flu of 1968. It's bad. It kills some people, but it's not historic in the way that this just incredible social contagion that we're experiencing is.
That's really the real virus, isn't it? The social.
It is. I mean, yeah. I mean, we started by the book originally was called Viral because we thought, okay, that's going to be the story. Actually, the publisher, I think, was smart to come up with The Price of Panic, but I actually think that's the real story. And the question is, you call it a dress rehearsal. I don't know how much of this is planned. I don't know how much of it is serendipity, but there's no doubt that people with despotic tendencies now know exactly how to get us to comply. Yeah, if we were just told you need to sort of lock down for your own good, we probably would not have complied. But instead, we've been told, okay, maybe you're going to be fine, but we need to lock down for the sake of other people. You might be asymptomatic, go to church, cough, and the old man in front of you will catch the virus. He'll go to the nursing home and you'll kill a bunch of people. That's, I think, the moral jujitsu that made the difference for us.
And if you look at the number of people who have, putting aside for a moment the question of malfeasance and inaccuracies on death certificates of what an actual cause of death is. So let's assume that when the CDC quietly revises their numbers from 162,000 deaths to under 7,000, that they're being honest in that case. The COVID-19 goes after the same basic low-hanging fruit demo that influenza A and B did, as the Hong Kong flu did, namely old people over 70 with comorbidities who are in poor, vulnerable health anyway. In every other pandemic, as you say, those are the ones we safeguard. We quarantine ourselves and we protect the vulnerable, but we don't burn the whole house down to kill a termite everywhere.
No. No, that's exactly right, and that's why the guy that was in charge of these things under President George W. Bush's administration, when the sea change happened, actually resisted it. He said, "Look, this is going to be a disaster." Not only that, is recently, Patrick, is 2019, the World Health Organization. They did a major meta study about exactly a year ago, surveyed over 200 scientific articles and papers, and said this idea of lockdowns probably won't make any difference in the next influenza pandemic. It'll destroy economies, it'll hurt the poor, and it won't even really make all that much difference. So we don't advise it. Then they changed their story sometime in the middle of the frenzy here in 2020. And then just a few days ago now, they've come out and are actually again advising governments not to use lockdown. So they're actually returning to their original position. I guess they get the sense now that maybe the winds are changing and people are starting to realize the lockdowns weren't a great idea.
I grew up in Nova Scotia. The province of Nova Scotia has a population of 972,000. They've been at 0 deaths for a few weeks now, very few cases. But the province is still locked down. If I go to visit my 85-year-old dear mom, I have to go into a 14-day quarantine.
Wow.
Now, so it's the whole province is basically looking at the whole thing through the rearview mirror, but the oligarchs are doubling down, I guess because they can.
Well, they can, and also I think there's also the reality is that once they've pushed it, at some point they'd need to say, well, this didn't seem to have worked, and in fact, maybe the cost was greater than the benefit. So they'd sort of have to admit a mistake, and so they just keep doubling down. But I think we show fairly decisively in the book, we analyze the case curves and the death curves, just as sort of official numbers, and then map those against the government lockdown dates, which we have, compare all the individual U.S. states, compare countries against each other. It turns out that the government lockdowns had no discernible effect on the spread of the virus. In other words, the best that can be said is that the coronavirus is utterly indifferent to government-enforced lockdowns, which means we're not really weighing, okay, what are the benefits of the lockdowns versus the costs? There probably weren't any benefits. And so all we actually have is costs. That's absolutely devastating.
Yeah, and devastating financially and economically in ways you can measure, but also, as some of the presenters at the Truth Over Fear Summit are going to get into, the psychic effects on children to be surrounded by a world of adults who are frightened and wearing masks. Because it's easy for us to say, look, this too shall pass, this is a weird phase. But if you're under 5, this is 100% of your experience.
That's exactly right. I mean, it'd be, for many kids, it will be their first memories will be that they were thinking about everyone in church and everyone on the street as a potential killer, right? As opposed to their neighbors that they're trying to get to know, their fellow parishioners. Oh, those are people that could spread a deadly disease and kill me. And they're actually manifesting itself in their bodies, on their faces. And at the moment, I mean, we can't measure that, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is going to have really severe long-term psychological effects.
One of the presenters is Matthias Kilsted from Sweden, who's going to talk about I call it the quasi-non-lockdown. They did have a kind of modified lockdown, but that's a complicated question because Swedes see their government differently than Americans see their government. But it was mostly self-imposed, the way most human beings have done from time immemorial. That is, oh, don't hug me, I got the flu. Oh, I don't want to take that flight, I got a cold. I'm going to stay home from work. We naturally do that. You've got a chapter here. Why did we believe lockdowns would work? And isn't this the maddening part of it? Is that if you buy into the panic, if you think the price of panic, to go off the book's title, is worth it, then you're going to, I don't know what the Latin phrase for the fallacy is, but you're gonna retrofit the relative in your mind, the lack of deaths, the flattening of the curve, so to speak, and you're going to credit the lockdown. It's like if I said, if I snap my fingers, I'm going to keep rogue elephants away. And you say, Patrick, you're crazy. And I say, have you seen a rogue elephant here lately? It works.
They're nowhere. No, exactly. It's basically unfalsifiable. I mean, this is the problem. And this is why we insist that we say, okay, look, what we want to say is if the lockdowns made a difference, how would we tell? And if no one's willing to ask that question and answer it, it basically means they're not willing to test the claim. But in principle, they should be willing to test the claim. And in principle, if the lockdowns made a difference, we should see a discernible bend in the curves, 10 or 11 days after the government lockdowns went into effect. And we don't see that in any case. We're not saying that social distancing, as you said, the kind of voluntary things that we do naturally made no difference. It's just that those were already figured in. And so remember, it was weeks for most of us. We've been told that there's this virus. We all make local judgments based upon our situation, like we do with the flu or anything else. That was already baked into the pudding. So the government imposed lockdowns. All they did is just completely demolish the economy and the kind of social interactions that we had, but they didn't actually do anything with respect to the coronavirus.
One thing I've noticed about all of this is that when more information is presented and even splashed around media outlets, people go, yeah, but you still got to wear your mask. For instance, when the Neil Ferguson and the Imperial College number, massive, super inflated hyperbole, what was it, 2.2 million will die. It was like a bad
2.2 in the United States.
It was like a Hal Lindsey equivalent of medical predictions that didn't come true. That all those models fell apart as false. But it didn't connect. It wasn't an idea that stuck. You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what makes us think this is a social contagion, right? Because normally in our normal lives, we update our ideas about things based upon new information, based upon new evidence. This is impervious to it. So it's like the wildest conspiracy theory in which, if you show somebody evidence against it, they'll just say, well, that's just how good the conspiracy is, right? That's just what they would do. And in this case, it's like anything you point to, it sort of gets assumed into the overall story. And so once people sort of click into this panic mentality, it's actually very hard to get them out of it. We're trying in the book at least to make the arguments and say, look, if you're interested in the evidence, here it is. But I mean, really, ultimately, the question is, if you are in the middle of a social contagion, right, in the middle of the madness of crowds, what would you use to check yourself? It's easy to talk about the Dutch tulip panic, hundreds of years later when you're not in it. How would you tell when you were inside one? I think that's the question. It's a sort of epistemic question we all need to ask because we're in the middle of it and we need to be able to wake ourselves up.
One thing that I hear a lot from people anecdotally, and I know it's not scientific, but it's better than nothing, is that when they are talking with friends and family about all this, who have completely bought into the panic, who are, all chips in for wearing the mask and keeping away from grandma, that they look at you like, what is wrong? Like, why don't you, the science is settled. They sort of repeat the media generated mantras as a way of segregating you, kind of making you into a pariah. One of the presenters, Dr. Mark McDonald, who's with America's Frontline Doctors, tells an anecdote in his talk. I've seen it. It's pretty interesting. He was sipping water on a flight, and I can say it's Delta because he mentions it. And he had a remonstration with the flight attendant. Turns out it was an ex-police officer who is now the flight attendant. And at the end, he got a stern talking to, and they sort of took him off the plane first to make him an example of him. He heard later, everyone on the plane applauded at his removal. And he wasn't sneezing, putting snot everywhere. He was just taking too long to drink.
Yeah, I mean, we've internalized this. I mean, this is why it's gone on so long. If this was just a government imposition on an unwilling populace, it would not have lasted very long. It's lasted so long because for the most part, certainly in the United States, most Americans internalize this to the tune of 70 or 80% of the population at one point. It's now, I think, split about 50-50. Once the majority of the population realizes, okay, wait, this is not what we originally imagined it was going to be, then I think it doesn't last very long. But as long as the population is scared, I think it will continue.
A fearful populace is pretty easy to manage, no?
Absolutely, especially when, that sort of levers of fear are continually bombarding us, because that's the reality. That's the other part of this story is the way in which media and social media have continually terrified us, so that the average American, according to this amazing poll in July, the average American thinks 9% of the population has been killed by the coronavirus. Well, that is 150 times larger than the reality. So where do people get that impression? They're not reading the CDC website. They're getting that information from media and from social media, which is vastly, of course, exaggerated the dangers.
Larry Elder says famously, I'm not sure where he gets this, but there's a truth to it, that if, according to polls, 10% of the population believes that if you write Elvis Presley a letter, he will read it. So in the same, in the same basic stream or tradition. In the magic world, there's a joke about how to do magic effects, and that is if you want to hide your secret, put it in a book. CDC is pretty easy place to find, but people are much
really
more
eager
to think of the experts as the new high priest, the new oracle of truth. Used to be actual priests,
That's
then it
right.
became news anchors. Now it's white-coated expert individuals.
Well, if they were only white-coated, I mean, it ends up being these government officials, effectively, public health experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci. There were always very serious scientists saying this is a terrible idea, but they aren't the ones that had the ear of the president and the prime minister. It was the head of the World Health Organization and the CDC and Anthony Fauci. It was these scientific officials, unfortunately, and that's what we refer to when we're talking about the tyranny of experts.
Yeah, it's a curious thing that doctors behave like politicians and vice versa. To me, that's a first.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a first. I mean, the very fact that we know Anthony Fauci's name, for instance, right? And so normally these would be sort of private actors that would be one of a dozen advisors that presidents would listen to, and then they would weigh their advice and then make a prudential judgment. The media in this case, though, they elevated these public health officials to the status of infallible oracle, so that if any politician like President Trump wanted to disagree with them, he was portrayed as effectively disagreeing with science and wanting to kill people. That's a really unviable position, and that's what I think we have to fix, and we have to fix before the next time.
Where do you stand on the politicization of COVID-19? Do you think this is going to vanish or greatly diminish after, November 4th?
I was thinking for a while that's what was going to happen. But honestly, I mean, I'm looking at the numbers and I watch, I follow different people on Twitter, and I notice that people are on the left side of the spectrum. Most of them are genuinely terrified. Now, I do think there's some cynical politicians that will go unnamed that are telling us they're terrified, but then we get these private videos of them not wearing masks, and it tells 100%. Me they're cynical. But I do think there's a large segment of the population that's, say, getting almost all its information from NPR and CNN that are genuinely terrified. So I think it would be actually, let's say Joe Biden wins the election, I think it'd be very hard for him to suddenly turn on a dime, though I do think that the incentives to lock down and the media incentives would change after the election. Honestly, whoever actually wins the election in the United States.
Last question, Jay, because I've got 24 hours more questions here based on your fine book. What is the metric that will be used to determine, okay, the pandemic's over? We're now looking at it in the rear view.
Well, what it should be is something like absolutely verified deaths, right? That's the thing. But those have been going down, even with changing definitions of COVID deaths, those have been going down. Hospitalizations have been going down. And so we switched to cases, which is, of course, those are artifacts of the numbers of tests that we're doing. If we're doing 1 million tests a day, you're going to get a lot of so-called cases, which are really just positive tests. That's all they are. And they're not all that significant. What's happening now, so far as I can tell, when I talk to lockdown partisans, they say, well, once we have a vaccine that's widely available, then we can let up. That's a disaster because, first of all, we have no guarantees that there will be a vaccine, certainly that there'll be a vaccine anytime soon. The FDA's never approved a vaccine for a coronavirus, and so I think that's going to be some serious heavy lifting. And so I really don't like talking about a vaccine because it ends up being an excuse to maintain the lockdowns, and it makes no sense because, one, we have solid evidence the lockdowns don't make any difference, and two, we've got lots of evidence that they're a complete disaster. So at this point, I was inclined to be forgiving of politicians in March who made certain calls. In October, though, we have way too much information. So if you're still calling for lockdowns at this late date, I think you're culpable for that.
Right. Well, thanks for writing the book. Really, if you're listening right now, maybe for the first time, it's the book to get. I'm sure more will come out of the pipeline. It's The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. Douglas Sachs has a background in a serious one in biology. William Briggs, the famed celebrity on Twitter, is a statistician, PhD level, and you, Jay Richards. Thanks so much for writing the book, and I'm really looking forward to your talk at the Truth Over Fear Summit. You're going to do a deep dive with some slides, maybe some coloring. What?
Yeah, actual images and actual data. I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, you'll be joined by Dr. Leland Stillman, Brigadier General Robert Spalding, Dr. Dolores Cahill of Dublin, Irish playwright and journalist John Waters, German attorney Rainer Fulmick, Rocco Galati from Canada. There's a long list now. It's 20 plus from 8 different countries, and I look forward to it. So if you want to sign up, you're listening right now, registration is free. If you want to get access by way of a premium pass and participate in the Q&As and also download these talks forever, because they might not last. Big Tech are playing whack-a-mole with people who stand up against the Fauci doctrine. So restoretheculture.com is the website. You can also find a link below this video to pick up a copy of The Price of Panic. If you want to answer for Karen, it's all here. Thanks a lot, Jay. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure.